The wedding planning meeting at my parents' house was supposed to last an hour. 3 hours later, my sister Allison was still talking, and I was still standing near the kitchen doorway, holding a tray of iced tea, like I'd wandered into the wrong room. And no one had noticed yet. "You can help in the kitchen," Allison said, without even turning toward me. She said it the same way someone might say, "Pass the salt." Casual, automatic, completely certain it was the natural order of things. My mother, Linda Bennett, nodded distractedly as she flipped through a stack of glossy wedding magazines spread across the dining table. "That would be helpful, Claire," she said. "People are getting thirsty." I set the tray down and began refilling glasses while Allison continued presenting what she clearly saw as the most important project of her life, her wedding. The dining room table had disappeared under color palettes, floral samples, guest list, spreadsheets, and venue brochures. My father, Robert, sat at the end of the table, pretending to understand discussions about linen textures, while Allison's fiancé, Mark Sullivan, leaned over her laptop, studying cost estimates. But Allison wasn't worried about cost. She was worried about perfection. "And then you walk through the rose garden," she said, sliding a brochure toward Mom. "The ceremony would be right here. The reception in the ballroom after sunset. Look at those chandeliers." Mom's expression softened, like she was looking at a painting in a museum. "Oh, Allison," she said quietly. "That's beautiful." The brochure rotated across the table until it stopped in front of me. Magnolia Harbor Estate. A photograph filled the page. A restored coastal mansion overlooking the marshes of Kiowa Island, South Carolina. White columns sweeping lawns. A glass ballroom glowing under golden sun evening light. I knew that building. I knew every hallway in it. I knew exactly how the sunset looked from the terrace. Magnolia Harbor Estate is the venue right now. Allison continued, leaning back with the satisfaction of someone who had discovered the crown jewel of wedding planning. "Everyone in Charleston wants to get married there." Mark frowned slightly at the brochure. "Isn't that place expensive?" he asked. Allison waved the concern away. "It's a once-in-a-lifetime event," she said. "You don't compromise on your dream wedding." I poured another glass of iced tea and kept my expression neutral. Allison tapped the photograph with a manicured fingernail. "This place is perfect," she said. "Perfect." The room filled with soft agreement. My mother imagined the ceremony. My father imagined the photographs. Mark imagined the price tag and tried not to look nervous. No one asked what I thought. That part was normal. To my family, I was the practical one, the quiet one, the sister who handled spreadsheets and logistics, while Allison dazzled people with courtroom confidence and carefully curated ambition. I sat down at the far end of the table, just outside the circle of conversation. Allison glanced toward me briefly. "Oh, Claire, you can help coordinate things behind the scenes," she said. "Vendors, timelines, deliveries. You're good at organizational stuff. Behind the scenes." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of 20 years of assumptions. I nodded. "That makes sense." Allison smiled, satisfied. Then she flipped the brochure open again and continued describing the ceremony she had been dreaming about since she was 12 years old. But while she talked about marble staircases and waterfront sunsets, I was looking at the name printed across the bottom of the page. Magnolia Harbor Estate. 6 months earlier, my investment company had quietly purchased that property after the previous owners defaulted on their development loans. My company restored the gardens. My company renovated the ballroom. And technically, my company owned every single square foot of the venue Allison had just chosen for her dream wedding. I reached across the table and slid the brochure a little closer. Allison didn't notice. No one did. But as I studied the photograph of the mansion glowing in the evening light, a single thought moved quietly through my mind. My sister had just fallen in love with a wedding venue. She had absolutely no idea who owned it. The conversation about Magnolia Harbor Estate didn't end when the meeting finally broke up. It simply moved rooms. My mother carried the brochure into the living room, like it was something fragile, settling onto the sofa, beneath the tall windows that looked out over the backyard. Late Saturday afternoon light filtered through the trees, turning the glossy pages almost golden. Allison sat beside her, immediately, leaning over the photos with the pride of someone unveiling a masterpiece. "Look at the ceremony lawn again," she said, pointing to the image. "Imagine the chairs set up facing the water." Mom studied the picture carefully. "Oh, Allison," she murmured, "it really does look like something out of a movie." Dad wandered in from the kitchen with a glass of iced tea, glancing at the pages over Mom's shoulder. "How many people can that place hold?" he asked. 300 easily," Allison said. "But we'll probably keep it around 220. Elegant, but not crowded. Mark sat in the armchair nearby, scrolling through something on his phone. "Did they post their pricing online?" he asked. Allison shrugged, unconcerned. "Some of it," she said. "But venues like that expect you to contact them directly." She said it the way people say things about places they already assume they belong. I stood by the bookshelf, pretending to organize a stack of old family photo albums while I listened. Magnolia Harbor Estate. The name still echoed quietly in my head. The photograph on the brochure showed the mansion at sunset, the white columns glowing softly, while lanterns lined the garden path. It was a good photo. One of the marketing team's best shots, actually. I remembered the first time I saw the property in person, 2 years earlier, when it wasn't glowing at all. The gardens had been half dead. The ballroom ceiling leaked during heavy rain. The old owners had taken out development loans they couldn't repay after the tourism downturn. By the time my investment firm got the call from the bank, the place was weeks away from foreclosure. Most people saw a failing wedding venue. I saw a historic coastal estate that had been mismanaged. The location alone was extraordinary. Kiowa Island's marshland stretched for miles behind the property, and the sunset over the water looked different every night. Restoring it had taken months. Structural repairs, landscape restoration, a full renovation of the ballroom. When the venue finally reopened, it quickly became one of the most talked about event spaces in the Charleston area, which was exactly why Allison had found it. She flipped another page in the brochure. "And the bridal suite upstairs is huge," she continued. "There's a private balcony overlooking the marsh. Perfect for getting ready photos." Mom smiled, already imagining the pictures. Dad nodded thoughtfully. "Well," he said slowly, "it certainly looks impressive." Mark shifted in his chair. "Did you check if your date is available?" Allison lifted her phone. "I already did," she said, with quiet satisfaction. "June 14th is open." She looked around the room like she'd just solved the final piece of a puzzle. "That's exactly 6 months away." Mom clasped her hands. "That sounds perfect." Allison closed the brochure gently and rested her hand on top of it. "I'm calling them Monday morning," she said. Her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who believed the next step was simply a formality. "I want to speak directly with their wedding coordinator and lock the date before someone else grabs it." Mark nodded. "Good idea." No one noticed that I'd stopped organizing the photo albums. No one noticed that my eyes had drifted back to the brochure on the coffee table. Magnolia Harbor Estate, the place Allison had just fallen completely in love with. And Monday morning, she planned to call the venue herself. I turned away from the bookshelf and headed quietly toward the front door. Because while my sister believed she was about to contact the wedding coordinator of Magnolia Harbor Estate, I already knew exactly what would happen when that inquiry reached the owner's office. Monday morning arrived quietly. The kind of crisp, late autumn morning Charleston gets when the humidity finally loosens its grip and the air feels a little sharper, a little clearer. By 8:30, I was already sitting at my desk in the small office above Harborline Capital, the investment firm I had built over the past 7 years. The office wasn't flashy, just a renovated brick building a few blocks from the historic district, but the tall windows looked out over the harbor, and the morning light made the water shimmer like glass. Most of my employees wouldn't arrive for another 30 minutes. That quiet half hour was my favorite part of the day. I opened my laptop and logged into the property management system our company used to oversee several of our hospitality investments along the Carolina coast. Hotels, event venues, a handful of historic properties that most investors had ignored because restoring them required patience and more money than quick-turn developers wanted to risk. Magnolia Harbor Estate sat at the top of the screen. Even now, the name still carried a certain gravity. 2 years earlier, the property had been a financial disaster, waiting to collapse. Today, it was one of the most requested wedding venues in the region, which meant Mondays were usually busy. Over the weekend, our website collected inquiries from couples researching venues. Those requests appeared in the booking dashboard Monday morning for our events team to review. I clicked open the inquiry list. There were 6 new submissions. The second one made me pause. Patel Sullivan. Wedding inquiry, requested date, June 14th. Estimated guests, 220. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. Then I leaned back in my chair. Allison had moved fast. I opened the file. The application had been submitted late Sunday night, probably after the planning meeting ended. The contact information listed Allison Bennett as the bride and Mark Sullivan as the groom. Everything looked exactly the way a typical inquiry would. Name, email, guest count, preferred ceremony locations. Except this one wasn't typical. Because I knew the bride, I closed the window for a moment and looked out toward the harbor. Seagulls drifted across the water. A ferry moved slowly past the marina. Then my phone buzzed softly on the desk. An email notification. Sarah Whitman. I smiled faintly when I saw the name. Sarah had been Magnolia Harbor Estates event director since the reopening last year. Before that, she had coordinated luxury weddings in Savannah for nearly a decade, and she understood high-end event logistics better than almost anyone I'd met. Her message was short. Morning, Claire. New booking inquiry for June 14th, Bennett/Sullivan. Shall we proceed with standard financial verification? I tapped my fingers once on the desk. Standard verification was exactly what every serious venue used. Large weddings meant large budgets, and Magnolia Harbor's weekend events required deposits substantial enough that our accounting team verified financial documentation before confirming bookings. The system didn't care who the client was, celebrity, corporate, or someone who happened to share my last name. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text message. Mom, Allison is calling the venue this morning. Fingers crossed. They have the date. I looked at the message. For a moment, then I returned to Sarah's email. Yes, proceed with the full verification process. I hit send and closed the laptop halfway. Somewhere across Charleston, my sister was probably getting ready for work, confident that the next step toward her dream wedding would be simple. All she had to do was make one phone call. What she didn't know yet was that the venue she had fallen in love with didn't run on excitement or Pinterest boards. It ran on contracts, deposits, and financial verification. And this morning, for the first time, my sister's wedding plans had just entered the system. By early afternoon Monday, my phone had already buzzed 3 times with notifications from the family group chat. I didn't open the messages right away. Mondays at Harborline Capital tended to move quickly once the staff arrived and the morning had filled with property reports, renovation updates, and 2 conference calls with a hotel partner in Hilton Head. But eventually, curiosity won. I opened the chat during a quiet moment between meetings. Allison, this is ridiculous. Mom, what happened, Allison? That venue has the most insane requirements I've ever heard of. I leaned back slightly in my chair. The messages continued appearing one after another. Allison, they want full financial verification before even confirming the date. Dad, that sounds unusual. Allison, exactly. Like we're applying for a mortgage just to get married there. Mark joined the conversation a moment later. Mark, they mentioned a deposit, too. Allison, a huge one. Mom, well, sweetheart, luxury venues probably have policies like that. Allison responded immediately. Allison, it still feels excessive. I set the phone down and stared at the harbor outside my window for a moment. Nothing Allison had described was unusual. Magnolia Harbor Estate hosted large events that sometimes cost more than small houses. Our financial verification policy existed for one simple reason. People occasionally tried to book venues they couldn't actually afford. It happened more often than most couples realized. My phone buzzed again. Allison, Claire, you work with business systems, right? Does that sound normal to you? For a moment, I just watched the message on the screen. In my family's mind, I was the quiet sister who worked with systems, the one who had chosen spreadsheets over courtrooms. They had never asked many questions about Harborline Capital, which was fine with me. I typed a short reply. Claire, most high-end venues verify finances for large events. It's standard business policy. The typing indicator appeared almost immediately. Allison, well, it's inconvenient. Another message followed. Allison, but I'm not giving up that easily. I could practically hear the determination in her voice. A few minutes later, she added another message. Allison, if they think paperwork is going to scare me off, they're wrong, Mark replied cautiously. Mark, maybe we should look at a few backup venues just in case. The response came quickly. Allison, no. The word sat alone in the chat like a small declaration. Allison Magnolia Harbor Estate is perfect. Mom added a heart emoji. Dad said nothing. I locked my phone and returned to my computer, but the conversation lingered in my thoughts. Allison had always been like that. When she decided something belonged to her life, she moved toward it with complete confidence that the world would eventually rearrange itself to accommodate her plans. It had worked for her many times before. Law school, her position at the firm, the carefully planned life she was building with Mark. But businesses didn't rearrange themselves around personal expectations. Businesses followed contracts, numbers, policies, and the Magnolia Harbor Estate had all three. My email chimed softly. A message from Sarah Whitman. Quick update, Claire. Ms. Bennett asked several questions about our financial process this morning. She sounded determined. I smiled faintly at the screen. I could imagine that tone very clearly. Sarah continued. She mentioned possibly visiting the estate to discuss options in person. I tapped my pen lightly against the desk. That part didn't surprise me at all. Allison was not the type of person who accepted obstacles from a phone call. I typed a short response. Understood. If she requests a consultation schedule, it like any other client. I sent the message and closed the email. Across town, my sister was probably already convincing herself that the venue's policies were simply a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a confident conversation. Maybe she even believed someone at Magnolia Harbor Estate would recognize her determination and bend the rules. But Magnolia Harbor didn't operate on determination. It operated on documentation. And somewhere inside the estate's booking system, the Bennett-Sullivan inquiry was quietly moving through the same process every client faced, whether they knew it or not. By Tuesday afternoon, Allison was driving toward Kiowa Island in a navy blazer she usually saved for important client meetings and courtroom appearances. I knew that because she had posted a mirror selfie to her Instagram story around noon with the caption, "Handling wedding business like a professional." By 2 o'clock, she was pulling through the long gated entrance of Magnolia Harbor Estate. I wasn't there. At least, not where she could see me. My office that day was in Savannah, but Magnolia Harbor's internal camera feeds gave me a quiet, grainy view of the front drive, the courtyard, the ballroom entrance, and the reception hall. I didn't sit there watching like someone waiting for a show. I had reports to sign, payroll to approve, and a conference call with a contractor about roof repairs at another property in Beaufort. Still, when the alert came through that a consultation had begun, I clicked into the live feed. Allison stepped out of her car, holding a leather folder against her side. Even through the camera, I could recognize the set of her shoulders. Controlled, confident, prepared to be the most persuasive person in the room. Sarah Whitman met her at the front entrance and led her through the estate with the same calm professionalism she brought to every prospective client. They moved first through the main gardens where the winter rose beds had been trimmed back, but the structure of the paths still framed the water beautifully. From there, they toured the ballroom with its restored plasterwork and crystal chandeliers, then the upstairs bridal suite overlooking the marsh. I watched Allison pause by the terrace rail and look out toward the water. Even through a muted security feed, I could tell what was happening. She was falling for the place all over again, maybe even harder now that she was standing inside it. A few minutes later, Sarah called me. "Your sister is very polished," she said, her voice careful and professional, though I could hear a trace of amusement underneath. That sounds like Allison. She brought financial statements, a projected budget, and what appears to be a handwritten list of reasons. She believes June 14th is the perfect wedding date. I let out a slow breath. Has she asked for an exception yet? Not directly, Sarah said, but she's moving in that direction. I swiveled my chair toward the window and looked out over the river. The truth was, I had spent all morning thinking about that word, exception. Not because Allison had asked for one, because for the first time since this started, I realized I could give one. I was the owner. If I wanted to waive a requirement, reduce the deposit, or tell Sarah to move the file forward without full verification, no one would stop me. It would be easy. A family favor wrapped in business language. A quiet rescue no one would ever fully understand. And for a few minutes, I hated how tempting that felt. Not because Allison deserved it, because some part of me still wanted what I had wanted my whole life with my family. To be useful, to make things easier, to smooth over discomfort before it hardened into conflict. Sarah's voice pulled me back. "She's asking now," she said, very politely. "She says there must be some flexibility for strong candidates who simply need a little room to finalize things." I closed my eyes for 1 second. There it was. Not a misunderstanding, not a clerical issue, a request for the rules to bend for her. I thought about the planning meeting, the tray of iced tea in my hands, the way Allison had pointed me toward the kitchen without even looking at me, the way everyone at the table had accepted that assignment as natural, behind the scenes, helpful, convenient. I opened my eyes. "No exception," I said. Sarah was silent for half a beat. "Understood. Treat her exactly like any other client." After we hung up, I sat very still at my desk. Something had changed, and I knew it had. Up until that moment, I had told myself I was staying neutral, letting business be business, letting policy speak for itself. But neutrality had an edge now. I was no longer just watching the process unfold. I was choosing not to interrupt it. And once that choice was made, there was no easy way back. An hour later, Sarah sent one final message. She would like to speak directly with ownership. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing my answer. "Tomorrow. Schedule her for 11. Then I closed the laptop. For the first time since Allison told me I could help in the kitchen, I wasn't standing quietly at the edge of the room anymore. Wednesday morning arrived bright and unusually warm for late autumn. By 10:30, I was already at Magnolia Harbor Estate. The drive from Savannah had taken just under 2 hours, and I had arrived early enough to walk the grounds before anyone else noticed me. The marsh beyond the gardens shimmered under pale sunlight, and a light breeze moved through the live oaks that framed the property. It was quiet in the way large places often are before guests arrive. I unlocked the upstairs office that overlooked the terrace and set my laptop on the desk. This room had once belonged to the original estate owners a century earlier. When we renovated the building, I kept the mahogany desk and the tall windows. They gave the room a kind of calm authority that suited business meetings. At 10:52, my phone buzzed. Sarah Whitman. "She's here," Sarah said. I looked down from the office window. Allison's car had just turned into the circular driveway. She stepped out, wearing the same navy blazer she'd worn the day before. Her leather portfolio was tucked under one arm. From this distance, I could see the same confidence in her posture that she carried into courtrooms. Sarah greeted her at the front steps. They spoke briefly before heading inside. Through the tall hallway windows, I watched them cross the marble foyer and disappear into the ballroom. I didn't move. Not yet. Sarah's consultation with her lasted almost 40 minutes. I knew the routine. First the full venue tour again, then the pricing breakdown, then the financial policies explained in careful, professional language. Eventually, the conversation would reach the same place it had reached yesterday. Policy, requirements, verification. At 11:37, my desk phone rang. I picked it up. "Claire." Sarah's voice was calm, though I could hear tension beneath it. She would like to speak with ownership. There it was, the moment we both knew had been coming. "Did she ask politely?" I said. "Yes," Sarah replied. "Very. And is she still confident there's been a misunderstanding?" A small pause. "Yes," I smiled faintly. "Send her up." 3 minutes later, there was a knock on the office door. It opened before I could answer. Allison stepped inside. She stopped so suddenly, the door swung lightly behind her. For a moment, she simply stared at me. Her eyes moved across the room. The desk, the framed architectural plans of Magnolia Harbor's renovation hanging on the wall, the certificates and property documents mounted beside them. Then back to me. "What are you doing here?" she said. I leaned back slightly in the chair. "I have a meeting." Her confusion deepened. "With who?" "With you," I said. Allison blinked. For a few seconds, she seemed to search for some explanation that made the scene logical. Her voice came out sharp. "Claire, this isn't funny. I asked to speak with the owner." "Yes," I said. "I know." She shook her head, already dismissing the possibility forming in her mind. "No, I mean the actual owner." I folded my hands on the desk. "That would be me." The silence that followed felt thick enough to touch. Allison's expression shifted rapidly. Confusion, disbelief, then a defensive kind of certainty. "That's not possible," she said. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. "This venue books weddings for $50,000. You work with systems or something." I didn't correct the description. Instead, I slid a document across the desk. The framed ownership certificate from Harborline Capital, Magnolia Harbor Estate. Property holder, Harborline Hospitality Group. Managing partner, Claire Bennett. Allison didn't sit down. She stood there staring at the paper, like it might change if she looked long enough. "You're serious," she said quietly. "Yes." She exhaled slowly, still refusing to fully accept what she was seeing. "Well," she said, finally, recovering a little of her courtroom composure. "Then, this is actually perfect." I raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Her tone shifted into something smoother. "Because now we can clear up this whole misunderstanding." She placed the leather portfolio on the desk and opened it. "I assume your staff just misread our financial situation. Once you look over these documents, I'm sure we can move forward." For a moment, I didn't answer. The confrontation had begun, but Allison wasn't attacking yet. She was still defending the version of reality she believed had to be true. And I realized something quietly as I looked at her. This was the first time in our lives that my sister had walked into a room expecting authority, only to discover she didn't have it. Allison remained standing across my desk for several long seconds, one hand resting on the open leather portfolio as if it anchored her to the moment. The initial shock had faded. In its place came something more familiar: strategy. I had seen that shift before, at family dinners, when she debated politics with my father, or during the few times I had watched her in court years ago. Allison's mind reorganized quickly. Once the ground beneath her shifted, she slid a few papers across the desk toward me. "Here," she said calmly. "Our financial statements, projected budget, and the revised payment timeline." Her voice had regained the smooth confidence of someone presenting an argument. "Once you look at the numbers, I think you'll see the situation is manageable." I glanced at the documents without touching them. They were well prepared. Mark's salary from the architecture firm, Allison's income from the law firm, savings accounts, a detailed spreadsheet projecting wedding expenses down to individual vendor categories. Allison had done her homework, but it didn't change the numbers. Magnolia Harbor's Saturday events required a deposit structure that assumed liquidity well beyond what those papers showed. Allison leaned forward slightly. "I understand luxury venues have policies," she said. "But policies are usually flexible when someone responsible is involved in the conversation." I met her eyes. "They're flexible when the financial risk is covered. That's exactly what these documents demonstrate." "No," I said quietly. "They demonstrate that you're stretching your budget." The words hung in the air. For a moment, the courtroom composure cracked. Allison straightened slowly. "You're my sister." "Yes. And you're telling me the venue you own won't host my wedding. I'm telling you the venue will host any wedding that meets its requirements." Her expression hardened. "That's not the same thing." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." She crossed her arms. "So what are my options then?" I slid the contract folder from the edge of the desk and opened it. "3," I said. "Full deposit as listed." Her lips tightened slightly. "Or a financial cosigner with verified assets." She let out a short breath. "And the third option, choose a venue that fits your budget." The room went very quiet. Outside the tall windows, the marsh water moved slowly with the incoming tide. Allison stared at the contract folder for several seconds before speaking again. "You're serious about this?" "Yes." Her jaw tightened. "You're really going to hide behind paperwork and pretend this has nothing to do with us?" I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was more complicated than she realized. This wasn't revenge. Not exactly. It was simply the first time our roles weren't arranged the way my family expected. Finally, she shook her head. "You know what people will say about this, right? Probably a lot of things. They'll say, you sabotaged your own sister's wedding. They'll say what they want." Allison picked up the portfolio again and slid the documents back inside. For a moment, it looked like she might simply leave, but she stopped at the door. Then she turned back. "There's going to be a family meeting tonight," she said. Her tone carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed she still had another battlefield available. "I'm telling Mom and Dad everything." I nodded. "That's your decision. You should come." "I might." She studied my face like she was searching for hesitation. When she didn't find any, her expression shifted again, this time toward something sharper. "We'll see how confident you are about these policies when the whole family is sitting in the same room." Then she opened the door and walked out. The hallway fell quiet again. I sat there for a moment, looking at the contract folder, still open on the desk. The truth was Allison had just done something I hadn't fully anticipated. She had moved the conflict out of the business world and into the family, which meant the next conversation wouldn't happen in a quiet office overlooking the marsh. It would happen at my parents' dining table, where every assumption about our lives had been built. By 7 that evening, I was back at my parents' house in Charleston, standing in the same dining room where Allison had told me I could help in the kitchen 4 days earlier. Nothing in the room had changed. The same polished table, the same chandelier overhead, the same framed family photos along the sideboard. And yet, everything felt different. Allison was already there when I arrived, seated upright at the table with her leather portfolio beside her, like evidence prepared for trial. Mom stood near the kitchen doorway, wringing a dish towel between her hands. Dad had taken his usual chair at the head of the table, his expression unreadable. Mark sat beside Allison, looking tired, in a way that suggested he had already spent hours trying to calm her down and had failed. No one offered me tea this time. No one asked me to help with anything. I took the empty chair across from Allison and waited. She began before I had even settled fully into my seat. "Claire has been lying to all of us," she said. Her voice was controlled, but only just. "She owns Magnolia Harbor Estate. She let me go through this entire process without saying a word, and then she used the venue's policies to shut me out." Mom turned to me at once. "Is that true?" I looked at her calmly. "I own the estate through Harborline Hospitality Group, yes." Mom stared at me. "You own it?" Dad leaned forward slightly. "Since when?" "A little over 6 months." The silence that followed was not disbelief anymore. It was recalculation. Allison opened the portfolio and pulled out copies of the venue paperwork, placing them on the table as if the documents themselves might prove betrayal. "She could have helped us," Allison said. Instead, she sat there and let me look foolish. Mark rubbed one hand across his forehead. "Allison, no," she cut in. She knew exactly what she was doing. I kept my eyes on the papers instead of on her. The contract summary, the deposit requirements, the financial verification clause. The same terms every client saw. Mom sank slowly into a chair. "Claire," she said softer now, "why didn't you just tell us?" That question landed differently than Allison's accusation. Not angry, just unsettled. I could have answered a dozen ways, and every one of them would have been true. Because no one asked. Because in this family, Allison's success was always the headline, and mine was background noise. Because when I sat in this very room, I was useful when I was quiet, and inconvenient when I wasn't. But I chose the simplest truth, because it never seemed important to anyone I said. No one spoke. Dad picked up the contract copy and read through the deposit section. Then he looked at Allison. "These are standard terms." "Yes," Allison said sharply. "That's not the point." "It might be," he said. She stared at him. Mark finally spoke, careful and measured. "They did tell us the same thing twice. On the phone and in person." Allison turned toward him, stunned by the lack of total allegiance. "So now you're taking her side?" "I'm saying it sounds like venue policy." The room shifted, almost imperceptibly. Not enough to resolve anything, just enough to make Allison realize the family meeting wasn't going exactly the way she had planned. She turned back to me. "So that's it. You hide behind contracts and let me scramble for another venue." I met her gaze. "No, that's not it." For the first time that night, every face at the table focused completely on me. I folded my hands in front of me. "The truth is, Allison Magnolia Harbor is a business. And if you had walked into that process as anyone other than my sister, no one in this family would expect an exception." Mom looked down at the paperwork. Dad said nothing. Mark exhaled quietly. I could feel the room settling, not into peace, but into a clearer shape. The outrage was no longer simple. The old assumptions had cracked, and everyone could feel it. Allison saw it too. That was the real reason her expression changed. Not because I had won, because for the first time, the story she wanted the family to believe was no longer the only one in the room. When I stood to leave, no one stopped me. But as I reached the doorway, Dad spoke behind me. "I want to understand what Harborline actually is," he said. I turned back. His voice was steady, not accusatory, serious. It was the first real question anyone in my family had asked me about my work in years. And I knew, standing there, with one hand on the doorframe, that something had already started moving. Not forgiveness, not resolution, just the beginning of the truth taking up space where assumptions used to live. By Friday afternoon, Allison had signed a contract with a vineyard venue outside Charleston that looked lovely in photographs and fit her actual budget. I found that out the same way I found out most family news these days, through a message thread that started with too much enthusiasm and carried too much strain underneath it. Mom sent the first photo, a row of bare winter vines, a white event tent, a stone tasting room lit with warm amber sconces. "It's beautiful," she wrote. No one answered for almost 3 minutes. Then Allison replied, "It will work. Not it's perfect. Not I'm excited. Just it will work." I stared at those 3 words longer than I meant to. There was nothing wrong with the vineyard. It was elegant, well-run, and probably a better fit for her guest count than Magnolia Harbor had ever been. The ceremony lawn overlooked rolling fields instead of tidal marsh. The reception space was smaller, simpler, easier to manage, practical, reasonable. A venue chosen by budget and logistics instead of fantasy. In other words, exactly the kind of choice Allison had spent her whole life treating as second best. By Monday, the consequences of that shift had spread farther than the venue itself. Aunt Marianne called my mother to ask why Allison had changed locations so suddenly, after spending weeks describing Magnolia Harbor Estate as if it were destiny. A cousin in Charlotte texted Mark asking if the first venue had double-booked them. Someone else asked whether there had been a problem with financing, which traveled through the family grapevine quickly enough to reach Charleston by dinner. Nobody had the full story, but the shape of it was becoming obvious. Something had happened, something expensive, something embarrassing. And Allison, who had always moved through the family with polished certainty, suddenly sounded careful when people asked about wedding plans. That Monday evening, my father called me for the first time in months without my mother prompting him. "I looked up Harborline," he said, by way of greeting. I stood in my kitchen in Savannah, one hand resting on the counter, listening to his voice carry an unfamiliar blend of curiosity and restraint. "And it's not small." "No." He was quiet for a second. 12 properties. "Across 2 states," I said. Another pause. "You did all that yourself?" I almost laughed at the question, not because it was cruel, but because it arrived so late. "With a good team," I said. "But yes." He let out a slow breath. Then more quietly, "I should have asked sooner." That was all. No apology, no dramatic reckoning. Just a sentence heavy with the weight of years. Sometimes, that was more unsettling than an argument. By the middle of the week, Allison stopped mentioning Magnolia Harbor altogether. In the group chat, she posted color samples for the new venue, revised seating sketches, and a shorter catering list. The messages had a clipped efficiency to them, like she was trying to outrun her own disappointment. Mark sounded calmer now, almost relieved. Mom tried too hard to be upbeat, which only made the adjustment feel more visible. And me, I kept working. Magnolia Harbor hosted a rehearsal dinner for a medical conference on Thursday, then a charity gala on Saturday night. The ballroom lights glowed across the marsh exactly the way they had in the brochure Allison once held at my parents' table, and I stood for a few moments on the upper terrace after the last guests left, looking down at the place she had wanted so badly. This was the part people usually misunderstood. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. The karma in all of it wasn't that Allison lost everything. She didn't. She was still getting married. She still had a beautiful venue. Her life had not collapsed. What changed was smaller than that and somehow heavier. For the first time, her confidence had met a boundary that would not move just because she expected it to. For the first time, the family had seen me standing on the other side of that boundary. And for the first time in my life, no one had asked me to step aside so someone else could have the room. Allison's wedding day arrived 3 weeks later on a mild Saturday afternoon in early spring. Charleston had that soft, coastal light that makes everything look gentler than it really is. The vineyard venue she had chosen sat on a low hill outside the city rows of young vines stretching across the fields, and a white ceremony arch set against the pale sky. It was smaller than Magnolia Harbor, but it was beautiful in its own quiet way. I arrived just before the ceremony began. Guests were already filling the rows of wooden chairs set up on the lawn. My parents sat together in the second row. Mark's parents were nearby, talking softly with the officiant. Mom noticed me first and gave a small wave. Not dramatic, just real. Dad stood when I reached them. "You made it," he said. I said I would. He nodded, then hesitated for a moment before adding, "Your mom showed me pictures of Magnolia Harbor's gala last weekend. That place, it's something." I smiled slightly. "Thank you." For the first time in a long while, the conversation between us didn't feel like it was balancing on old expectations. It simply existed. A few minutes later, the music began and everyone stood. Allison appeared at the end of the aisle, her dress catching the sunlight as she walked forward. She looked beautiful, composed exactly the way she had always imagined herself on a day like this. For a moment, I wondered what she was thinking as she crossed the lawn toward Mark. Whether she was still angry, whether she blamed me, or whether the last few weeks had simply forced her to accept something she had never needed to consider before, that not everything in life bends around the version of the story you planned. When she reached the altar, she didn't look at me. And that was all right. The ceremony itself was simple and calm. Mark's voice trembled slightly during his vows, which made a few people smile. Allison spoke clearly and steadily. Her hands folded together around the bouquet. The wind moved softly through the vines behind them. Nothing dramatic happened. No confrontations, no whispered accusations. Just two people making a promise while a small circle of family and friends watched. After the ceremony, guests moved toward the tasting hall for the reception. Music drifted across the vineyard courtyard, and the long wooden tables were set with candles and pale flowers. At one point, Mom found me near the edge of the patio. "You seem peaceful," she said quietly. "I am." She studied my face, as if checking whether that answer was real. Then she nodded. "Good." Across the courtyard, I could see Allison laughing with one of Mark's cousins. Her shoulders relaxed in a way they hadn't been in weeks. For the first time since the venue incident, she looked less like someone trying to control the narrative and more like someone simply living inside the moment. Maybe that was the real change. Not defeat. Perspective. I stayed for the first dance and part of dinner, then slipped away just before sunset. Driving back toward Charleston, the sky faded into warm pink and gold over the marshland. My phone buzzed once while I was on the bridge. A text from Dad. "Proud of you, Claire." That was all. I read it twice before putting the phone down. The truth was, I hadn't needed Allison to lose for things to finally shift. All it took was standing my ground long enough for everyone to see where it actually was. And sometimes, that was the kind of justice that lasted. If you've ever had a moment where standing up for yourself quietly changed the way your family saw you, I'd love to hear about it. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, consider liking and subscribing so you don't miss the next one. There's another story waiting for you just ahead.